There's quite a back and forth in the chat about the importance of recruiting rankings and how high you have to be placed in the rankings to compete for a national championship. Here's my thought. The national champions during the playoff era and before were consistently ranked in the top 5 in the recruiting rankings. The one slight exception to that would be Clemson, that won national championships with classes that were anywhere from 5 to 15 in the country. They had some classes that were 11, 12, something in that range. They also had a fairly light conference to deal with that got them through to the playoffs. And then they had generational quarterbacks. They had great quarterbacks, and I think that makes up for a lot. And Deshaun Watson putting up 500 yards on an all-time great Alabama defense in the 2015 championship game, I think underlines that. The other thing that I think needs to be talked about, and I've mentioned it here once or twice, that's really come to my attention in the last few months in looking at the recruiting rankings, is the separation in the recruiting rankings. Again, the distance between 1 and 5, and then 5 and 10, and 10 and 50, it's not equal. It really drops. If you have a number 10 recruiting class in the country, that's great. You did a great job. Those are really good players. You can win with them. Most likely, though, all things being equal, it sounds ridiculous. You will probably not be able to win a national championship with the 10th best recruiting class repeated over and over, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. Because the difference between the 1, 2, 3 classes and 10 is like 10 to 40. It is. Now, there can be some exceptions, but again, Clemson's the only slight exception to that. And their recruiting rankings were really good, but not just stacked elite every one of those years that they made it to a national championship game. But Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And when you think about, and I think about this from a coaching perspective, you want the if I have my choice between having the best players and having maybe a step below, and I know that evaluations can change. I mean, some people are, um, overhyped. Some people are underhyped just based on the number of, camps that they get to and things like that. But at the end of the day, as a coach, yeah, I want to have the best players. I want to have the best players on my team. And if there's other schools that have better players than me, chances are, even though all of them don't work out, if I have my pick of the best players, eventually that's gonna win out. And so to your point, Mark, yeah, it's possible. I think, and I think to a certain degree um the transfer portal, the transfer portal really kind of, maybe I don't know that it evens it out, but it brings a little bit of a different flair to that. Whereas you can be a top 10 team but have great years in the portal, and then that could be a little bit of an equalizer. But no, I mean, I think that the thought that you can win with a bunch of you can win at Oklahoma with a bunch of 3 stars versus, I'm just going to throw a team out there, Georgia, with a bunch of 5 stars. Like, I mean, yeah, it can happen, but I think 7, 8 out of 10 times, probably the better players are going to win out. So yeah, and I think a lot, and this is, and not specific to Ron, but I think there's a lot of people that feel this way, and I don't know that frustration is the right word. Um, and I don't even know if concern is the right word, but there's a lot of people that are, that have their eyeballs out, and like Oklahoma's what, 30th, 35th, and in the 2023 recruiting rankings, and it's not something that Oklahoma has been accustomed to since Riley has come over, and it's just a different method in which Brent Venables feels very strongly about attacking recruiting. So, and I think part of the thought is, Oklahoma has been one of those teams that have lost a lot of recruits late, a lot of decommitments late. And I think the thought with this process is that Oklahoma will be the team that benefits from this versus the team that goes away. And it all remains to be seen, Mark. I mean, it all remains to be e- all the recruiting experts that I've listened to and I've heard talk, particularly even some of the local experts have talked a lot about preaching patience to Oklahoma fans that aren't accustomed to this. Oklahoma's accustomed to having a top 5, top 10, top even 2 or 3 class at this point. And just the change in which, that's happening right now is not um I guess super exciting for Oklahoma fans. So I would just say trust the process and see now if Oklahoma goes into um, February next year, and they've got, and I'm just throwing out a number. I don't know off the top of my head how many Oklahoma are going to take. If you got 12 3 stars and you've got 6 4 stars and a couple of 5 stars, you know, looped in there. Yeah, maybe it's time to certainly not question, but be a little bit more concerned. But I think you got to let this process play out a little bit with some and understanding is at least on the defensive side. There's a lot of um, new voices from a recruiting perspective that some of these kids are seeing at Oklahoma. Not necessarily new from a recruiting perspective, but new recruiting to Oklahoma versus recruiting to Clemson versus recruiting to Alabama versus recruiting to wherever some of these guys were from. So I think it's a different proposition than people are used to seeing right now. And so the patience is the mainstay right now for people that are a little bit up in arms with how Brent is recruiting and his staff is recruiting right now.
Yeah, so the recruiting rankings aren't perfect, of course, because players need to develop and they're being evaluated as 17-year-olds, and 4 years later, they're playing as 21-year-olds. And we have all sorts of examples all over the board of 5 stars crashing and 2 stars becoming, NFL players. But the best class, whatever's ranked to be and considered to be the best class in any given year, that may in the long run turn out to be the fourth best class, not the best class, the fourth best class, the third best class, whatever. But it's not going to be the 17th best class. And the 17th best class that was evaluated at that point when it was being recruited and signed is not going to turn out to be the best class.
Mhm.
They're pretty darn accurate. And what's crazy is they're not only accurate in determining, drawing almost a direct line from the recruiting rankings to the playoff. You can also draw a line between the recruiting rankings and the success in the playoff. Like there is a huge difference even between getting to the playoff and then having a legitimate shot and showing on the field that you can win a national championship. Like winning those 2 games against pick your teams, against the 3 or 4 that we all know. That's
That
that's
that
that's more
that's more money.
monumental than winning the 12 games to get there.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and just kind of food for thought here, and this is why I kind of talk a lot about being patient, and this is why, to a certain degree, that I think where some of these teams are falling right now in the 2023 recruiting rankings is very insignificant. So let me give you a couple of stats here, just are a couple of where teams rank in this 2023 cycle. First in the top 10, your number 6, 7, and 8 teams are Texas Tech, Cincinnati, and Northwestern. I think at the end of the day, we know that those teams are not going to maintain their top 10 rankings. And then when you look at, I just kind of looked at this. It was a little surprising even for me, but when you look at number 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, and 42, Oklahoma sits at number 37 right now. Number 38, Alabama. Number 39, Michigan. Number 40, Florida. Number 41, LSU, and number 42, Miami. And we all know that those, what is that, 6 schools that I just mentioned, those 6 schools are not going to be anywhere near that come the end of the day. So people need to let this play out more and more, than they do than they are right now. It'll Oklahoma. None of those teams are going to be anywhere near the 30s when it comes down to where some of these schools end. And yes, for Tim, that yes, USC is number 9. I only left them off because you expect, especially now, you're going to expect USC to be in the top 10 right now. But you've got some of these teams that just aren't typically in the top 10. And then you've got some, like obviously like Ohio State and Clemson and Georgia, that are in the top 5 that you would expect. But I think there's a couple of things to think about here from my perspective. Yeah, you're going to see some of these teams change, and you also got to think, especially like Georgia and Ohio State are recruiting at a level that not many teams are right now. I mean, look at the week Ohio State just had.
Yeah, they got 3 top 50 players in 3 consecutive days.
Yeah, and at least 2 of those were at the wide receiver position, right?
All 3 of them were wide receivers.
Okay. I remember 2 of them being wide receivers, because I know Brandon Ennis was a guy that was Oklahoma was in on, and then I think USC was previously committed to Oklahoma as well. But yeah, I mean those schools are recruiting at a ridiculous level, and so some of these other teams have a little bit to go. Certainly not Alabama, but some of those other teams have a ways to go. But on the other side of it, it's not the time to panic, because I think if there was a day while Nick Saban was the head coach at Alabama and they are in the 30s in the recruiting rankings, something's happened. So I mean, I think the same thing is going to be said for all of those schools, to be honest, Mark. And so people just need to be patient, let the process play out a little bit more.
You see a couple different approaches play out there from the elites too, because Alabama always sits back in the weeds and then they storm ahead once the season hits, and then they just start picking up recruits like bam, 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 bam. National Signing Day, they get a couple more flips, and suddenly, boom, number 1 class, number 2 class, whatever it is. Ohio State has the approach of locking these guys down early, then they just kind of sit tight, and they may have the number 1 class in July. Rarely if they finish with the number 1 class, but it's usually the number 3 class or 4 class, and that's what they do. They tend to just take a different approach to lock these guys down early. And the last point I'll make, even though I think it's fascinating about recruiting rankings, is I make that statement about just trying to inform and educate, as I kind of educated myself in the last year about the differences between these positions on down the line. But I don't like it. I wish I could look at a recruiting rankings list and see that Kentucky had the 13th. I think that's what their recruiting ranking was last year, 13th in the country, and think, man, if you pile up the 13th best recruiting class out of 130 teams over and over and over, I would hope that you could compete for a national championship, but you probably can't. I wish it was different. I wish it was more even, to where the space between number 10 and number 30 was the same as it, but it's just not. And it's crazy how it just cascades that quickly down the rankings. And I would like to see more parity in college football, absolutely, but we're not there right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's interesting. I was thinking about this. We talked a little bit about baseball and softball, before we started. And when you think about into a lot of the major sports right now, Mark, obviously Oklahoma was the overall number 1 team in the softball side of things and won it. But other than that, there was a lot of parity in terms of the Women's College World Series. There was only 3 or 4 ranked teams. We talked a lot with baseball. It's happened with basketball as well. There's beginning to be tons of parity in the college game, no matter what sport you're looking at, with the exception of college football. It's the same. It tends to be the same teams, over and over again. It seems to be the same teams that are leading the recruiting rankings. And I think all of us, obviously, we're fans first, right? I mean, but that is what made us have a love for the game. We're fans of a certain school first, but I think still a lot of us like to see parity, right? We like to see the underdog come in. I mean, I think a lot of people like to see Cincinnati in the in the Final Four, in the playoffs last year. But we're still a ways away from that being reality. Hopefully, it continues to happen. Maybe slowly. Slowly. I think at this point last year we were talking about of these major conferences. When you look at the SEC, the Big 12, the Big 10, and the ACC, who's going to knock off the Giants? Like who's going to knock off Clemson? Who's going to knock off Alabama? Who's going to knock off Oklahoma? Who's going to knock off Ohio State? And it happened in a lot of these conferences, last year with Baylor winning the Big 12, with Pittsburgh winning the ACC, right? And then you've got obviously Alabama ended up winning the SEC, but Georgia won overall. In the national championship game, and then you saw what happened in the Big Ten as well with Michigan winning. So I think it's something that's happening. It's not going to be like a complete onset like in some of these other sports, but the parity is. I think it's good for the game if and when it does happen.